Well, we can now speak to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. And Frank, I just wanted you to talk us through what's happened over the last few hours, because we saw crucially that meeting between Turkey, Russia and Iran. And then now we're hearing from the rebel leader saying that there will be some kind of managed transition happening in Syria. How has this transition been managed by the external actors, but also within Syria at the moment?
Well, I think the important stuff has happened on the ground, not at Doha, where these foreign ministers were meeting, because Turkey, the foreign ministers of Turkey, Iran, and Russia were the key players in this. But really, the situation in the last 24 hours has moved so rapidly as the rebels advanced both from Daraa in the south and from Homs in the north to close in on the capital. And it's very clear that the Syrian army had no stomach for this fight. They defected, they had surrendered, they retreated, they tore off their uniforms, put down their guns and disguised themselves as civilians. This regime has crumbled very quickly indeed. Now, those foreign ministers I mentioned were part of something known as the Astana process, as in the meetings that people have held in Central Asia to try and thrash out a political future for Syria. Bashar al-Assad was not interested in talking about any transition of power whatsoever, and he has now paid the price. The early signs are quite encouraging that there could be an orderly transition of power. Why? Because the leader of the main rebel group, HTS, that's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this is somebody called Abu Mohammed al-Jawlani. He has said, we are going to respect minorities. There's not going to be a great big bloodletting of vengeance and so on. But he is only one person at the head of a very large, sprawling coalition of rebel groups. And there are some pretty hardcore jihadists in amongst them. Let's not forget that HTS is still a prescribed terrorist organization, prescribed by the UN and by many governments. It's going to have to prove itself in the coming days, weeks, and months that it is absolutely true to its word and has left its terrorist roots behind. Because people will be thinking about what happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban seized the capital, Kabul, and the whole country, and the international community disappeared. Taliban spokespeople were going on television saying, nothing to fear, don't worry, we're going to respect women's rights. There's going to, we're not like we were in the past. And they're exactly like they were in the past. It's been an absolute basket case for human rights and women's rights. So there are any number of ways in which Syria could now go down a very dark path. It could go the way of Libya, with rival factions, armed groups, descending into sort of tribal and religious friction. But so far, it's looking quite promising. And the West is largely staying out of it. It's going to be for Syria's own people to sort this one out, with the backing, hopefully, of the United Nations, and hopefully without too much meddling from outside countries.
And Frank, what do we know about HTS's capabilities to handle what is really a tense and fluid security situation across Syria?
Yeah, I mean, it's always very difficult where you've got rebel groups that have been in opposition for years and years and have been operating in a very small, tightly controlled area. In the case of HTS, they've just been in Idlib. They've been confined up to the far northwest of the country. They don't have any experience of governing non-Sunni Muslims and a wider cross-spectrum of people, because Syria is a patchwork of Kurds, of Christians, of Sunni Muslims, of Shia Muslims. And I think perhaps one of the biggest threats is friction between the Alawite minority from which Bashar al-Assad's dynasty comes. They are Shia. They're based in the northwest of the country, to the south of Idlib. There could be friction between them and the Sunni militants. And let's not forget that.
Sorry, Frank, I just wanted to add that we've got some images that have come in from Damascus which show damage to the Iranian embassy in the country. What do we know about this incident, and what does it tell us about perhaps people's feelings towards Iran in Syria at the moment?
Well, many Syrians felt that their country had become a sort of captive of Iran. Syria was the big Arab ally of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It was their big bases from which they channeled a lot of the weapons that went through to Hezbollah in Lebanon. There were very close relations between Bashar al-Assad's regime and the rulers of the Islamic Republic in Iran. So this is a huge blow for Iran, and Bashar would not have survived this long without the assistance he had in 2015, both from the Russian Air Force, but on the ground from troops and advisors and military help from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, plus Hezbollah. Both of those last two were absent this time because Iran and Hezbollah have been severely weakened by their conflict with Israel. And all of this dates back really to the October the 7th, 2023 Hamas-led raid into southern Israel. That triggered all sorts of chain reactions. Obviously, the Israeli assault on Gaza, which has resulted in the crushing of Hamas, but also the deaths of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. But the far-reaching consequences of this have spread well beyond the borders of Gaza or of Israel. It has meant that Syria's opposition, this rebel group, was able to seize the opportunity. They could see the opportunity and they took it with both hands to do this rapid lightning advance, first to Aleppo, then to Hama, then to Homs, and finally to Damascus, knowing that Russia was preoccupied fighting a war in Ukraine and Iran and Hezbollah were too weak to give Bashar the help he needed because his own army wasn't up for it.
And talk to us about Russia's interests in Syria, especially its access to the Mediterranean Sea. Why is that important for Russia and why would it want to hold on to that?
Well, this is Russia's southern flank in some ways. Russia entered the war in 2015 and lots of so-called Middle East experts, probably I was one of them, I don't know, a lot of people predicted this is going to be a disaster for Russia, it's going to be their Afghanistan. It really wasn't up until now. Russia's intervention in Syria was largely successful. It was a showcase for Russian weapons. It boosted their arms exports unpleasantly. But most importantly, rulers around the region, particularly in the Gulf, they looked at the contrast with how quickly America dropped their ally in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, when the Arab Spring protests erupted in 2011. As soon as those crowds came out into the streets of Tahrir Square and so on, America dropped him. But when the Arab Spring protests broke out in Syria, as in other countries, Russia stood by their man, Bashar al-Assad. Now, Russia's got its own interests there. I don't think there's any particular wasn't any great warm affinity on a personal basis, but Russia wanted to keep its base on the Mediterranean, Tartus, its naval facility. It's also got an airbase, or has had, at a place called al-Hamameim. The future of those bases is now uncertain, but Russia does have a fallback position in the form of Libya. It's got very close relations with General Khalifa al-Haftar in eastern Libya, based in Benghazi. It's got the use of air bases in Libya. So if it loses Syria, it still has a Mediterranean base. But by and large, this is a net loss for Russia. It looks weakened by it, and it's a setback geopolitically, geostrategically for Russia.
And in the midst of all of this, I guess the foreign power that might think their actions have been successful is Turkey. Just talk to us about Turkey's role in what's been happening over the last few days, but also crucially how it could shape what's going to happen next in Syria.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Turkey has backed the Islamist rebels. I think we should just define this word Islamist. It's not the same as Islamic. Islamist means somebody who believes that Islam, the religion, should be an integral part of government, shouldn't be separate. And so these rebels are Islamists. That doesn't mean they're the same as jihadists. There are some jihadists amongst them. I know this is slightly complicated. There is an overlap between them. Turkey is also largely, and it's pretty much an Islamist government. It's friends of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. So Turkey has been backing the rebels and will be very much involved, I think, in the future shape of Syria. It shares a long border with Syria, a fairly porous border in places, and it's got a vested interest in having a stable southern neighbor. I think a big question mark also hangs over what happens with the Kurds, because the Kurds control much, or the Syrian Kurds control much of the northeast of Syria, and that includes their control of a number of camps, prison camps, that are containing both members of ISIS, so-called Islamic State, and their families. If that control was to be lost through attacks by Turkey, then there is a risk that ISIS could become resurgent in Syria.
And a point on that, Frank, sorry to interrupt you. We've had a statement coming in from a US Pentagon official saying we are aware that the chaotic and dynamic circumstances on the ground in Syria could give ISIS space to find the ability to become active, to plan external operations. Donald Trump has said that the US should stay out of what's happening in Syria. But do you think that's going to be the case going forward?
Well, the US has a base in southeast Syria at a place called Tanf. It's right by the triple border with Jordan and Iraq. And there's about 900 US special forces and support logistics people there. Their job is to keep an eye on ISIS. And every now and then, CENTCOM, the US Central Command, will issue a press statement saying that they've carried out an airstrike on suspected ISIS or al-Qaeda positions. So even though ISIS was defeated in 2019, it lost its last stand at a place called Baghuz in Syria, and it lost its physical caliphate. Ideologically, it hasn't gone away. And organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda absolutely prey with P-R-E-Y, they prey on chaos, confusion, breakdown of law and order, where people feel dispossessed, that they've got no future. That's where they tend to step in and take advantage of it. So there is a risk if Syria starts to spiral, if Jawlani and the rest of his rebel group, if they don't establish a smooth transition of power very quickly and move to elections and basically calm the place down, if they don't do that, there is absolutely the risk that ISIS and al-Qaeda could become resurgent and form new bases and start planning international terror attacks from Syria.
And Frank, I guess it's important to remind our audience about just how deadly the civil war in Syria has been. You know, this is a war where we saw the emergence of ISIS, as we were discussing, but we also saw chemical attacks and intense Russian bombardments of cities like Aleppo. This really is a defining moment for Syrians. We've heard from people who are saying they're just grateful that perhaps they will have some days without being under bombardment in the country.
Yeah, I mean, Russian Air Force was bombing the rebels only a few days ago, right up to the last minute. So, you know, I don't think there's going to be much love lost between them. I can't understate, or overstate rather, the extent of the kind of prison gulag that Bashar al-Assad's regime oversaw. And it wasn't just him, it was his father as well, Hafiz al-Assad. So for older Syrians and older people in the Middle East, the name Hama is synonymous with that of a massacre, where Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar's father, essentially lays siege to a Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the city of Hama, in which well over 10,000 people, civilians, died. There is an entire network of prisons, not just Saydnaya, which is the famous one just outside Damascus. There were so many different branches of the military intelligence deep state that Bashar oversaw. You know, Air Force intelligence, home security intelligence, military intelligence, political intelligence. They all had their torture chambers. And the extent of organized systemic torture in Syria's jails is off the scale. So many thousands died under torture. So I'm afraid there are an awful lot of scores that people will want to settle. But for now, with those prisons being opened, and these are in many cases political prisons, we're not talking about people who've, you know, done a bit of burglary on the side. We're talking about people who have perhaps scrawled some graffiti on the wall. And if you remember back how this all started, back in 2011, 15 schoolboys in a town called Daraa in the south of Syria scrawled on a wall the Arabic phrase "Sha'ab yarid isqat al-nizam," meaning the people demand the downfall of the regime. That got them arrested, beaten up, abused, and one of them was very badly mutilated. That so horrified the people of Daraa that they came out in protest. That was met with bullets and repression. And then the protest took off. And Bashar could have listened to them. King Hamad in Bahrain, far from a perfect democracy, but he did at least listen to some reforms and put in a few reforms. But Bashar al-Assad refused all, he decided to tough it out, and he repressed everything with bombs and bullets and tanks and prison. And he's paid the price for it.
And Frank, I just want to share a line with you and the audience that we're getting, which is that the Syrian rebel coalition say they have started an attack on Kurdish forces in the northern town of Manbij. And I guess this goes back to those discussions we were having about perhaps what Turkey might want to see happening in Syria.
And so it begins. You know, that is not good news. The last thing Syria needs right now is another internal conflict. But yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that. I mean, if you look at the map of Syria, you will see the different areas under different control. There are Turkish-backed Islamist groups. There is this main rebel group that has taken Damascus. There is the Kurdish area, and there was, up until a few hours ago, the government-controlled areas. But the Kurds, I think, will be quite worried about this because Turkey considers that its main enemy, essentially, is the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is allied to some Syrian groups, and it has been bombarding some of the Syrian Kurdish groups. One of the things that the West worries about is that Turkey, a NATO member, could end up so damaging the Syrian Kurds that they can no longer keep control of those ISIS prison camps I was talking about, in which case we are going to see ISIS resurgent in northeast Syria. Again, the last thing Syria needs and wants.
Indeed, and just shows how this conflict could further spiral. And Frank, we just want to show our audience some pictures that we have coming in from Erbil in Iraq. They show people out celebrating, waving Syrian flags. We've also seen similar scenes in Turkey as well, really pointing to, you know, the millions of people who've been displaced out of Syria following the war. But now we've also seen images of some of them trying to get back home as soon as they can.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I did the 10 o'clock news last night in BBC, and I drove home through Oxford Street. And I heard what it sounded like gunfire. It wasn't, I'm glad to say. Basically there was a kind of convoy of Syrians celebrating, waving the flag of Free Syria, which is black, white and green rather than black, white and red. And they were honking their horns and letting off the sound of, it was some kind of fireworks, I think, but it sounded like automatic weapons fire. And they were celebrating already last night at about 10:30 at night. There will be a lot of people very relieved. I think the big question is what happens to the great Syrian diaspora, all those millions of Syrians who left Syria because of the civil war. They're not going to come back immediately. I mean, some people are already. There's convoys that have been coming from Lebanon back into Syria. But it's very early days yet. You know, I think the world needs to see that this transition can be peaceful and orderly and that it's going to work, and that Syria is not going to go the way of Libya and descend into chaos.